Welcome back to this online course in international economics. Last time we spoke about tariffs. Now we're going to talk about other instruments that may create barriers in international trade. The first one that Carabao introduces is quotas. So quotas are a physical restriction on the quantity of goods that can enter a nation. It sets a limit in whatever units that good is transacted in. For example, in kilograms, in liters, in whatever measure is used in international trade of that good. Note that in international trade, the imperial system is not adopted. We use the metric system in international trade. Here is an example of quotas for different products in the US. So, for example, condensed milk coming from Australia, we can only import 91,625 kilograms. However, if it comes from Denmark, we can import 605,000 kilograms or 605 tons. As you can see, there is a discrimination per country about the quantity that can be imported from there. So, we just saw an example of selective quotas because it's specific per country, but we may as well have global quotas, which is regardless where those goods are coming from, there is a finite quantity that can be imported, regardless of country of origin. Now, what are the welfare effects of imposing a quota? Well, it's going to be similar as before when the case of tariffs, in the sense that we're going to have a redistributive effect, a protective effect, a consumption effect, as well as a revenue effect. The revenue effect is going to be in the form of a rent, a license that is auctioned to the importers. So there's going to be a bidding. The different companies interested in importing that good are gonna bid to have a license to import those goods, and whatever price they pay becomes a government revenue because that money goes to the government as a form of fiscal revenue. Example, figure 5.1. So the scenario that is being portrayed here is, first you start with this openness to trade. There is free trade, no quotas. So this is the supply coming from the world, okay, particularly comprising the European Union. And if that was the case, the prevailing world price would be $2.50 per pound of cheese. There would be 1 unit produced domestically and 8 consumed domestically. So we'll have a total import of 7 units. Now let's say that the domestic producers of cheese lobby politicians, legislators for protectionism, and they achieve a quota. And in this case, the quota is 3 pounds of cheese. What's going to happen? So now the supply that we're going to focus is the domestic supply plus the quantity that can be imported. So it's going to be the supply of the US plus the quota of imported cheese. And therefore there's a parallel shift in the supply curve. This amount of the shift is exactly equal to the quantity imported. So what's going to happen is that the price of cheese in this country is going to go up from 2.50 to 5. This is a small economy. You can infer that because the aggregated world supply is flat, so it's a price taker, this nation. And now the price moves to $5 per pound of cheese. At that price, there's going to be a lower consumption domestically. Instead of consuming 8, the domestic consumers only buy 6 units of cheese at that price, the $5. And domestically, there are going to be 3 units produced. So the domestic production plus the quantity allowed to be imported, which is 3 units, gives the final consumption of 6 units. And the equilibrium point, where the price is determined, is at the intersection of that new supply curve and the domestic demand curve. How do you compute then the redistributive effect, the protective effect, the revenue effect, and the consumption effect? Well, note that the consumer surplus used to be all this, and now shrinks to this upper triangle. So the redistributive effect is this portion of the former consumer surplus that now is in the hand of the domestic producers. Note that this triangle over here is the new producer surplus. But this portion over here, this area A, bounded by the previous world price, this is the redistributive effect. The protective effect is this triangle B, this area over here, also bounded by the previous world price, by the quantity that was produced domestically, and the quantity that was produced domestically under free trade. So there is a height of 5 minus 250 and a run of 3 minus 1. Then you divide by 2 that product and you get the value for the protective effect. Recall that is the cost of, in this case, protecting, right, the domestic economy. And this part is going to be gone. Nobody is capturing it now. It used to belong to the consumer surplus, but now it does not belong to anybody in this economy. Similarly with the consumption effect, also bounded by a height of 250 and a run of 2, 8 minus 6. And then you divide this product by 2 and you get the value for the area of D. And this is the consumption effect, also gone from this economy. Area C is basically how much was collected from the importers of cheese as a license to import that cheese. This value can be approximated by computing an area. Yes, we can. 6 minus 3 times 250. That will give you the area C. But in reality, this value depends on how much money the government was actually able to collect in that auction for the licenses to import this cheese. But the grand conclusion is that there's still definitely a deadweight loss, and that deadweight loss is equal to, again, the protective effect plus the consumption effect in the case of a small economy. So the economy ends up worse off because the welfare is smaller than before. And again, illustrating the negative impact that protectionism has in the overall economy. Yes, we protected the domestic producers. They have a bigger surplus now, but at the expense of consumers and foreign producers because they are not selling as much as before. So the following slides talk about the process of allocating quotas. It typically is equal to the ratio of the import quota divided by the total quantity demanded collectively by US importers, and then the auction we just talked about. So a quota, as it limits the quantity that can be imported, is more restrictive than the tariff. Because under the tariff, pretty much you can import still as much as you want, as long as you pay the price with the tariff. But under the quota, there is a limit on the quantity. So even if you demand a lot, you cannot buy at all. Figure 5.2 illustrates that a quota is more restrictive than a tariff. Look first at this graph A when you're talking about the tariff alone. So let's say we have free trade at $6,000, okay? And then this government imposes a tariff of $1,000. So the new supply curve with the tariff is given by this flat curve. We're still talking about small open economies because the curve is flat when talking about the world supply. And note that even at 7,000, if there is an increase in demand from demand 0 to demand 1, people can still buy more. So the demand increased from 6 to 8, even though the price was now 7,000. And it can continue to increase, and people still buy the quantity that they want as long as they pay this price. However, if we're talking about the quota, it's more restrictive. So in this case, let's say we had free trade again, so similar scenario where people were buying 8 units domestic and just producing 1. And then there is the quota, that imposing the quota raises to 7,000. Okay? But if there is an increase in demand, what happens is that still only 3 units can be imported. So that extra demand has to be satisfied with the extra domestic supply, whereas in this case there was no need for that. And the price will continue to go up. It won't stay at 7,000. So the more the demand, the higher the price will be. We say it's more restrictive in the sense that for the consumers there would be no price change, and in the case of the tariff, whereas in the case of the quota it will be. So that's the illustration of how quotas are more constraining than tariffs. Which one will the domestic producers prefer as a form of protectionism? Well, obviously they would prefer a quota, because if there is an increase in demand, they will keep on producing more. Which one will the domestic consumers prefer? If there is a restriction that they cannot avoid, well, they would rather prefer to add a tariff than a quota, because in their mind is the lesser of two evils. Now we can also have a combo between a quota and a tariff. That's what we call a tariff rate quota. So what does it mean, a tariff rate quota? It means that there's going to be a quota, and the quantity imported within that quota is going to have a certain amount of tariff per unit imported. However, if there is an increasing demand, people will still be able to buy, but because the quota has been surpassed, the tariff is going to increase tremendously. Okay? The tariff is going to move to what we call an over quota tariff. Example, table 5.2. So let's say you want to buy peanuts, and up to the 30,000 tons imported, each kilo pays a tariff of 9.35 cents. But let's say we bought all these, we already imported all this quantity, and we want to import additional tons. What the government says is, okay, you can import more than this amount, but for an additional kilogram, you pay 188% as a tariff. Okay? So do you see that there is a mix here between a specific tariff, which is specific dollar amount per kilogram, and then changes to an ad valorem tariff as percentage of the market value of the good. Okay? Let's look at the case in both are set in the same type of tariff. So milk. If we import up to 5.7 million liters of milk, each liter imported pays 3.2 cents as a tariff. But if we want to buy, let's say, 6 million liters of milk, the 300,000 extra pay 88.5 cents per liter as a tariff. So you see the dramatic increase from 3.2 cents per liter to 88.5 cents per liter. This is the tariff rate quota system. It's less restrictive than a quota alone because it still allows you to buy more if you want. If it was just a quota, it would be illegal to buy more than these quantities. In the tariff rate quota, we're still allowed to do that, but the increase in the tax paid in importing this foreign good increases dramatically. The key point being that you still can buy it, even though at a much higher price. So in that sense, we say that the tariff rate quota is less restrictive than a quota. But the least restrictive of them all so far was the tariff alone. These tariff rate quotas also demand the license to import, and as in the simple quota system, there will be auctions to allocate these licenses to those individuals that want to be importers of these goods. For example, this is an instrument used in the sugar industry, where the quotas are set in a country per country basis, so it's a selective quota when we're talking about raw cane sugar. However, if we talk about refined sugar, it's a global quota. Basically, first come, first served basis. Don't care about the nation where the sugar is coming from. It's just about the quantity of foreign sugar that enter the nation. What are the consequences for the US economy of adopting this system? Well, we typically pay double the world price. So for example, in 2006, the world price was 10.42 cents per pound of sugar, whereas the average price in the US was about 20.94 cents per pound of sugar. So double the world price. That's the consequences of protectionism. And the estimate was that American consumers would be spending extra $2 billion a year on sugar than they would if the economy was open. But of course, there is also more people employed in the sugar industry in the US under protectionism than under free trade. So those are the trade-offs between implementing these policies. However, the welfare of the nation is always higher under free trade. That's why economists advocate for it. People need to focus in the export competing industries to get a job, not in those industries that are not able to compete in the global market. Another mechanism at the disposal of governments to give protectionism to local producers is to set a domestic content requirement. What is that? Well, that is the imposition that a certain percentage of it, let's say 50%, has to be produced domestically. The other 50% can be made elsewhere, but half of it has to be made here. Now, these numbers vary. There could be 60% here or just 20% here. But this is another instrument at the disposal of governments to protect the domestic producers and labor too. And typically is the labor unions or organized labor that lobbies for these domestic content requirements, so that there is work for the domestic labor. The consequences of it is again higher input prices, because if they were able to compete with foreign nations, they wouldn't be asking for protectionism, or at least it wouldn't be given. They wouldn't be asking for domestic protectionism. And it's subsidized by the domestic consumers, because the consumers end up paying a higher price. So here is an example of domestic content requirements from selected countries. So in Argentina, if you want to sell a car there, 76% of it has to be produced domestically. In Colombia, just 30% has to be produced domestically. So not surprising, when you visit Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, all these countries, you're going to see models from brands you recognize, let's say Volkswagen, but you never seen those models, because as a big portion of it is produced domestically, then they get also some freedom to make their own models that are more customized for the local needs and for the local purchasing power. So just a curiosity. But again, these domestic content requirements tend to be applied by the weaker economies. Another form of protectionism are outright cash disbursements for the producers, what we call subsidies. Right? So instead of imposing a tax on imported goods, instead of limiting the quantity of goods that can be imported, we can just give money directly to our producers per unit produced. And there are different types of subsidies. There could be subsidies just for domestic production. Anything produced domestically of that good gets a subsidy. Or we can subsidize just those units that are exported. At the end, what happens is the price that the producer gets is the price paid by the purchaser plus the subsidy. So the key idea is to give a lower price to the consumer because the extra is going to be paid by the government with taxpayer money. So imagine this. Let's say that our domestic producers can only produce cheese, like the previous example, at $5 a pound, but the world price was $2.50. So how can they compete in the global economy? Using a subsidy, what would happen would be the domestic producer sells to the consumers at $2.50, but gets an additional $2.50 from taxpayer money, from the government, as a form of subsidy. So at the end, they still end up receiving $5, but the consumer just paid $2.50. So as you can imagine, given that the price remains low, the negative consequences for the overall economy are less severe when compared to quotas, when compared to domestic content requirements, because the domestic consumer can still buy at the world price level. There is a loss, that's the amount of the subsidy, but at least you won't have the consumption effect. So you still have the protective effect, but not the consumption effect. And supposedly, this is going to lead to fewer negative consequences to the aggregate welfare of the nation. Because in the past, when we're talking about tariffs, when we're talking about quotas, the deadweight loss was always equal to the protective effect plus the consumption effect. Whereas if you use subsidies, you just have the protective effect. So that's why economists say that subsidies is the least harmful form of protectionism. This is what the following slides are explaining. Now, the scenario of dumping. What is dumping? Dumping is when foreign producers sell their foreign produced goods in our market at a price lower than the one that they sell in their own home, in their own country of origin, where those goods are made. If that is the case, if a foreign producer is selling, for example, here in the US, a product at a price that is below the one they charge in their home country, that is called a form of dumping. Why would the foreign producers do that? Well, for example, as a way to dispose excess inventories. Let's say it's a fashion company. Next year or next season, they are selling something totally different. So this stuff has to go, even if it goes at ridiculously low prices. So there are different types of dumping. There is the sporadic dumping, which is the case, as the name implies, is not done all the time by those foreign companies. It's just done when they have excessive inventories they want to get rid of. Predatory dumping is when they dump the products to conquer those market shares, to eliminate competitors from the market. trying to acquire a monopoly position. Then, if it was the case of predatory dumping, or any form of dumping, domestic producers will ask for protectionism from their government. And the governments could retaliate with anti-dumping duties. So it will be for like a tariff on that particular good from that particular company because is engaging in predatory dumping activities in our nation. The third case of dumping is called persistent dumping, the one that goes on forever, constantly and permanently selling abroad at lower prices than at home. And this will be the worst form of it. So remember, dumping is when a foreign producer sells in the foreign market at a price below the one they sell domestically. They can do this in three forms. One is sporadic dumping. They just want to get rid of inventories and they are targeting a foreign nation to do so. There could be predatory dumping as well, which is done with the ambition of getting a monopolistic position, basically taking out other competitors in that market. And third, the persistent dumping, the one that goes on forever. It's not just to get the market share, it's not just to get rid of inventories, it's something that they do forever, targeting that country. Why would a company do the dumping? Well, when it comes to profits, companies can do this. They can discriminate their prices domestically. Right? Look, for example, how much you pay for cable TV in Houghton and how much you pay for cable TV in Chicago. So they are allowed to charge a different price according to the market. Right? For example, here, let's say a package of TV and internet with cable connections goes for about $120, whereas in Chicago, $40-50. And this is perfectly legal. Why? Because it's done domestically. But if the cable company was doing this in another country, being from the US but doing it, for example, in Mexico, this will be called dumping. So it's natural, it's something normal that companies do to charge different prices in different nations. So we're going to compute the profits simulation for two scenarios given in this figure 5.5. So Carbau illustrates this by giving you three graphs. One shows the overall production of the firm. The other ones show you the markets where this firm operates, namely South Korea and Canada. The first scenario is a scenario where there is no price discrimination. So, given the demand function that aggregates the demand from all markets where this firm operates, we get this curve over here. Okay? And the demand curve has a kink over here. Note that it's not a straight line. The slope of the curve is quite steep up to this point, the 30 units, and then becomes relatively more flatter. So why is that? Because it results of the aggregation of the demand in South Korea plus the demand in Canada. Note that pretty much up to the price of $600, which lies here somewhere between 700 and 500, namely here, up to this point, there is only demand from South Korea. The demand in Canada, if the price is $600, is zero. If the price is lower, for example 500, then the demand is 10 units of steel. So when you combine both these demand curves, we have basically here a replica of the South Korean demand curve up to the price of 600, and then we have the remaining demand from South Korea with the demand for Canada and that gives us this other part of the demand curve, hence the kink. Okay. Then profit maximization requires the marginal cost to equate the marginal revenue in a perfectly competitive market scenario. You learn these in Principles of Economics. And the marginal cost curve is given here by MC, intersects the marginal revenue curve at this point. So this gives you what is the optimal quantity you should produce. From here, you extrapolate from the demand curve what is the price that should be sold at. The third curve on this graph is called the average total costs. So aggregates not only the marginal cost, but also other costs, the non-variable costs. Okay? So in total, the firm, to produce 45 units, he has an average total cost of $300 per unit produced. So let's write that down. The average total cost is $300 per unit. So the total costs are equal to $300 times the 45 units produced. And this gives a total cost of $13,500. So the average total cost is $300 per unit, and therefore the total costs is the $300 per unit times the number of units produced, which is 45. Therefore, the total costs are $13,500. Now let's look at the revenues. First scenario, no price discrimination. This means that the selling price is $500 in whatever market. Therefore, the total revenue is basically equal to the summation of price times quantity in all markets. So, as shown here in the graph for South Korea, if a price is set as $500, then that intersects the demand curve at this point, which corresponds to 35 units sold. So the total revenues are going to be equal to $500 per unit times the 35 units sold in South Korea. So this represents the South Korea revenues, plus how much do we sell in Canada. So in Canada, we refer to this graph in the middle. At $500, the consumers there are only willing to buy 10 units. So $5,000 is going to be our revenue, because it's equal to $500 times the 10 units we sell there. This is the revenue from Canada. Hence, the total revenue is gonna be $22,500. Hence profits are going to be equal to revenues minus costs, and this is before taxes profits, which we are ignoring in this scenario, taxes, assuming that there are no taxes. If that's the case, this firm, under the no price discrimination scenario, is going to have a profit of $9,000. 45 units produced, 35 sold in South Korea, 10 sold in Canada, for a total revenue of $22,500. When we take out the costs, we end up with profits of $9,000. Now let's look at the scenario of price discrimination. We're still producing the 45 units, but now we're going to have price discrimination. And how are we going to do this? Well, let's look at the graphs. It all depends on the elasticity of demand. Remember that elasticity is equal to the percentage change in quantity divided by the percentage change in price. So the elasticity of demand is pretty much asking how much is going to change quantity for every 1% change in price. This comes from the principles of economics course. The elasticity of demand gives you how much the quantity is going to change per each marginal change in price. In this case, we're talking about percentages, so it's per each 1% change, how much is going to change the quantity measured in percentage change. And what we see here is, well, let's do a full review of elasticity then. If it's greater than 1, we call this elastic demand. If it's less than 1, we call it inelastic. If it's equal to 1, we call it unitary elastic. Okay. So the rationale is we're going to charge the highest price possible when the demand is inelastic and charge the lowest possible when the demand is elastic. So you can determine how elastic the demand is relative to another demand curve by comparing the slope of both demand curves. So the one that is steeper is less elastic, and the one that is flatter is more elastic. So look, for example, here. If we change from the price from 400 to 500 bucks, the quantity demanded changes from 20 to 10. If we change here for in South Korea, the price from 400 bucks, note that 400 bucks will be here below 500, next square, in this corner here, which will intersect the demand curve over here, and this will give you 40 units because this is increasing in 5-unit increments. Each square is 5 units when it comes to the quantity. So this will be 40. So if the price increases from 400 to 500, the quantity demanded decreases from 40 to 35. So here the change in the quantity is just 5 units. And here in Canada, the change will be 10 units. So a much greater percentage change in the quantity for the same percentage change in the price. So as Canada is the more elastic market, we want to charge as low as possible there to maximize profits, and in South Korea we want to charge as much as we can in order to maximize profits. So in this case, Carabao is telling us, let's assume that the firm is going to discriminate the price across countries and is going to sell at $400 in Canada and at $700 in South Korea. So 25 units are going to be sold in South Korea and 20 units are going to be sold in Canada. How much are the total revenues now, and how much are going to be the profits? So total revenues equal to how much we make in South Korea. So it's $700 times the 25 units we now sell there. This is the South Korea component. And in Canada is $400 times the 20 units that we now sell there. Note that this price discrimination is constrained by the quantity that we have to sell. So we still have the same 45 units to sell. We're just now splitting those units across both markets in a different way because we decided to change the prices. Decided to discriminate the prices. So in this case, we're going to get revenues for South Korea and Canada aggregating up to $25,500. And therefore, profits now, which are equal to revenues minus costs, is 25,500 minus the same 13,500 that it costs us to produce those 45 units, and therefore profits increase. Before we were making $9,000 in profits, and now we make $12,000. This is the motivation that firms have to do price discrimination. Anti-dumping regulations. So the government can retaliate and impose a duty on those goods. Who does that? Well, the U.S. Department of Commerce, the U.S. International Trade Commission, they are the entities involved in assessing if there is dumping and how much injury that dumping is causing in order to determine what should be the amount of the duty. So imagine if there was already a tariff for those foreign goods, the ones coming from this specific company or specific nation would have an increase corresponding to the attempt of the government trying to offset the losses created by that dumping activity. So there is a need to determine what is the margin of dumping and calculate the foreign market value of the product. These are procedures that are necessary to compute, assess the amount of the damage that needs to be paid back. This is a complicated exercise, but that's what the government employees are there for. So typically the cost-based definition is given as such. There's the cost of manufacturing the merchandise plus general expenses, typically comprise at least 10% of the cost of manufacturing. Then the profit on own market sales, which at least should be 8% of the manufacturing cost plus general expenses, 8% on the top of that, and plus the cost of packaging the merchandise in order to ship it to the US. So then Carabao goes into describing some cases that occurred in the US against foreign companies. So talking about a case of typewriters, another case of apples, this time with Canada instead of Japan. So these things occur, and the government tends to intervene in order to protect the domestic producers. Within this context of trade conflicts, Carabao also alludes to the propaganda machines of corporations, the efforts that they do to protect themselves through trying to manipulate the consumer's opinion. Okay? Well, this is a funny case, well, curious case, hinting almost comedy, and involves fishermen of catfish. So the US market was acquiring a lot of Vietnamese catfish, and that's a comparative advantage that the Vietnamese have because of the natural conditions that exist there, plus the cheap labor. 500,000 of Vietnamese earn income from the catfish trade, so it's a relatively big industry in that country, and they were able to conquer 20% of the frozen catfish fillet market in the US due to the lower prices. Now, the catfish farmers in Mississippi, they were upset because they were suffering losses due to the international competition, and they decided to engage in a trade war. So, forcing to have more detailed product labeling, for example, the country of origin, to appeal to the nationalistic, the patriotic buyer, right? And lobbying for anti-dumping tariffs. They were trying to persuade the US government to close the catfish market to Vietnamese farmers. And the way to do this was to force the Vietnamese farmers to call their fish something else than catfish, because they wanted to use that name only for the American-born catfish. They also engaged in a disinformation campaign. So, for example, running ads calling the Vietnamese catfish slippery catfish wannabe, probably not even sporting real whiskers, floating around in third world rivers nibbling on who knows what. And they moved to an anti-dumping case against Vietnam catfish, saying that they were selling it much lower in the US than at home. So what was the conclusion? The US Department of Commerce did not have strong evidence that the imported fish were being sold in America more cheaply than in Vietnam or below the cost of production. So how were they able to give protectionism to the US catfish farmers? By declaring the Vietnam a non-market economy. This is quite a courageous move. So basically saying that we cannot compare the Vietnam market with the US market, and therefore we're going to impose a tariff anyway. And they resulted in a 37 to 64% tariff on Vietnamese catfish in order to protect the Mississippi catfish farmers. So what this illustrates is that there's not just one strategy to achieve protectionism from the domestic producers in whatever country. Here we are focused in the US because we are in the US. But this is done in other countries as well. And in addition to the lobbying campaign with government officials, there is the propaganda campaign, or as we call it these days in Western economies, public relations campaign, in order to manipulate public opinion in the favor of protectionism for domestic producers. So it's a quite fascinating endeavor because it has several dimensions of action in order to achieve what they want, which ultimately is protectionism. Then Carabao goes on discussing if anti-dumping law is unfair, given that we can do it domestically, but if we do it internationally, it's illegal. So, table 5.6, so showing how dumping increases profits. So instead of selling at 300, some units are sold at 300, but some other are sold at a price below in order to higher profits. So it's a motivation for companies to do dumping. So the controversy is high when dealing with anti-dumping firms because, after all, companies are competing among each other. And the world is increasingly smaller, meaning if they can do it domestically, why can't they do it abroad? Punishes firms that are simply behaving in a manner typical of competitive markets. Other forms of trade barriers. So far we discussed the quotas, the subsidies, the domestic content requirements, anti-dumping duties, and now we I'm going to talk about government procurement policies. An illustration of this is the Buy American Act. That was already enacted a couple of times in the US, for example in 1933. Note that this was at the eve of the Great Depression, right? So, which is typical, as we discussed before. Every time the economy slows down, there are increasingly loud outcries for protectionism. So, for example, the 1933 Buy American Act basically stipulated that federal agencies should buy materials and products from US suppliers if their prices were not unreasonably higher than those of foreign competitors. So ambiguity left there for having a more free management of what was the definition of unreasonably higher. And when it comes to domestic products being sold, at least 50% produced domestically. So clear, strong barrier on international trade in favor of domestic producers. But these things never work out properly because, yes, those workers end up being protected and those producers, but at the expense of everybody else in the economy, and the economy as a whole ends up worse off. So instead of focusing on our competitive advantage, we are focusing on protecting our weakest parts of the economy, the ones that cannot compete globally, instead of supporting those that can compete globally. That's where the growth is, those that can compete globally. The ones that cannot compete globally typically are dying industries. We're just slowing down how fast they are going to disappear. There was also stipulations for preferences, namely how much the US suppliers of civilian agencies, how much were they preferred over foreign firms. So a 6 to 12% preference margin, 50% margin for the Department of Defense, and these could be waived, these preferences, if the domestic producers would not produce enough quantity of it, or if the quality was not good enough. Nonetheless, all these types of policies are barriers to free trade, which create dead weight losses in society. So we talked about that 1933 Buy American Act, but we had one also in the US in the eve of the meltdown of the housing market, so from 2007 to 2009. It crossed both administrations, starting the Bush administration and continued during the Obama administration. Remember that when Obama became president in February 2009, there was additional fiscal stimulus to the one that was already being given by the Bush administration. And the Buy American Act was adopted by both administrations. What this highlights is that regardless of the party in power, they tend to accommodate the demand for protectionism due to the perceived political gains they may achieve. Because we already know as economists that overall the economy is going to be worse off with these trade restrictive policies. However, votes are more important to politicians than the national well-being. That's what we typically observe around the world. The priority is to win elections, not to make the country better off. If they coincide, that's when the nation as a whole enjoys the biggest gains. Unfortunately, this coincidence of wants is rare across the world. This is not a US specific issue. So lastly, Garbaut talks about other forms of regulation that still comprise non-tariff trade barriers, such as social regulations. Those related, for example, with the environment, the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, EPA, and related with fuel economy standards, like the CAFE standards, and these are in the US, right? Well, in the EU, there's also similar things. One that is different is the ban on hormone-treated meat, because the Europeans are concerned about public health issues related with eating meat that has been fed with growth hormones. So these social regulations, they vary per country according to the standards of living that they want to achieve. Now, these relate to trade because basically what they say is any good sold in this market has to follow our standards. So if foreign producers do not follow those standards, they cannot sell their products there. So it acts as a form of protectionism. This might be better than protecting specific producers because these are protecting public goods like the environment or health related issues. For example, when it was regulated that toys for children could not have lead in it, the paint used to paint those toys could not have lead in it. So what it meant was that regardless of foreign or domestic production, no toy sold domestically could have lead in it. And that is an example of public good, not protecting a producer, but protecting rather something that belongs to all.